Welcome to the Growth and Resilience Network. My name is Mark Johnson. This is not Steve Piscitelli, your typical or usual host. We're coming to you from the beautiful confines of the GRN headquarters, world headquarters, I guess Steve has told me, which actually is his home here in beautiful, gorgeous Atlantic Beach, Florida. My name is Mark Johnson, currently the Director of Development and Public Relations at the Arc of Alachua County in Gainesville, Florida. We were the subject of a wonderful podcast that GRN did last year on our client with Prader-Willi syndrome. Fabulous podcast, and we appreciate Steve doing that for us. So, Steve, welcome.
It's good to be in my home.
It is
studio.
Good. Thank you for inviting me into your home. I know how hard that was for you. We're turning the tables here on the Growth and Resilience Network. We're going to be interviewing Steve Piscitelli. I am going to be interviewing Steve Piscitelli. Just a little bit of a background before we head into the questions. The topic today is public education, the nature of public education, the future of public education. The reason that I am here today interviewing Steve is because of two things, really. Number one, my wife Jackie and I had the opportunity to see A Passion to Teach, a very powerful documentary movie about teaching in the public schools that was made a few months ago. It was it's a very popular documentary, very powerful one. It sparked a lot of conversation between my wife and I, who currently is in public education as a public information officer in Gainesville, Florida. But it also inspired me to think about some of the best teachers I've had and or seen at work over my lifetime. And Steve Piscitelli is always the first name that comes to mind when I think of the very best public school teachers I've ever seen. He is without a doubt the best public school teacher I've ever seen in action. And I thought it might be an interesting idea to turn the tables and talk to Steve a little bit on the Growth and Resilience Network about public education, his thoughts on it, where he sees it's headed, and some of the challenges that it faces. So, Steve, are you ready for some questions?
I'm ready, Mark. This is good. And, Mark and I taught together at Stanton College Preparatory School in Jacksonville, Florida for a number of years. And so I got to learn from him as well. So this is going to be fun. Mark is, he's one of those intellectuals that I have always
Are you rolling your eyes when you're doing that?
So go, Marky. Let's go. Let's see what we got here. And I appreciate this. This is going to be fun.
Yeah, I think this will be a good time.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about public education, Steve. Let's start specific, and then we'll branch out a little bit. Steve, why and how did you get into public school teaching?
Kind of was a bit of a circuitous route. When I first went to college, I was going to be a teacher. And during my freshman year, I switched to criminal justice, various reasons, and ended up going down that path. Worked with the sheriff's office here in Jacksonville for 6 years in the jails and prisons division as a counselor, as a corrections officer, counselor, and then the director of the work release program. And then I decided I wanted to start working with people before they hit the jail system. And I love the classroom environment, always had. I wanted to be with young people, young ideas, and I was always a good student, and I just gravitated back into that. And I hit the jackpot in that once I had my degree already, so I just had to do a few courses for education certification, and a new school was opening, or at least a new program. Well, it was really a new school in an old building, and it was Stanton College Preparatory School, public school, magnet program here in Jacksonville, and I ended up being an intern there the first year it opened. And I fell in love with the school, fell in love with education, and just got jazzed and kept going with it. Just loved it, absolutely loved it. And I was able to be surrounded with phenomenal people, not only the students, but the faculty and a lot of the administrators I worked with.
So you said you fell in love. What made you fall in love with public education?
Well, it was the constant, I don't know if it would be public education or the classroom, but it was this constant atmosphere of learning, and every day was a different day for me. And you got to consider, I came into teaching, I was 30. So I wasn't the usual teacher coming in, 22, with no worldly experience, so to speak, career experience. And I kind of came in with some different expectations and what I wanted to do. And I was always somewhat of an envelope pusher. And I was fortunate to work with people that allowed me to do that. Public education, even at Stanton, the magnet school that it was, drew a lot of different folks. It was a diverse group in there, intellectually, behaviorally, socioeconomically, the whole gamut. And I loved that. I just loved that idea. And I was able to do some things, starting with 7th graders, doing some programs that just were phenomenal because of the support I got and because of the way the students responded. And it just one thing led to another, led to another, led to another. And yeah, we all have our difficult days, but I can say I never had a bad day. It was just, I was always excited. I was at school by 6:30, 6:45. I was never one of those teachers that ran out with the buses. I got involved in extracurricular activities, did the talent show, got involved with clubs, and, at one point the senior class sponsor, junior class sponsor. Enjoyed all that. It was fun. Ended up teaching 7th through 12th grade. It was fun. I don't know if that's very sexy, but that was fun.
In the documentary A Passion to Teach, one of the educational philosophers mentions that the very best teachers, the very finest teachers, are mavericks in thought and deed. It sounds almost, you didn't use the word maverick, but you push the envelope, you use some of that language. Do you consider yourself a maverick?
I'm going to go to the first part of that. Yep, I think the best teachers are the mavericks. And it also depends on a definition. I'm talking about mavericks with a purpose. I'm talking about people that aren't just doing it to show off and doing things that will be detrimental to their students. And I think I was. There was a book I read, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, Teaching as a Subversive Activity. Forget the author's name, but I just loved that. And the idea that I think I wanted to model that for the kids, which was always challenge, question me, challenge me, in a civil manner, polite manner, but challenge. Don't just accept things. And again, because of the school I was in, I didn't have to ask that too often. They did it on a regular basis. I think the mavericks, they're the folks that look to the future. I think the mavericks are the ones who look for the weak signals. I think they're the ones that are saying, do we really want to prepare our students for today, or do we want to really prepare them for 10 years down the road? And I always wanted to keep in mind that the most important thing wasn't the curriculum, although obviously, yes, that was important. And I was a stickler about the discipline that I was teaching. But it was the relationships that were developed with the students. That was the key. That was the key. Not, you got to do this at this time, at this time. It was the relationships and pushing. I don't know if that's being a maverick, but I was going beyond just the test. I was going beyond that. At least I was attempting to.
The middle school teacher profiled in this documentary, Passion to Teach, teaches in a rural community in Connecticut. She'd been teaching for decades. And she at one point says, people learn from the people they love. Do you think that's true? And do you think, second part of this question, Being a maverick, were you able to develop these relationships with your students that you taught in your classroom to the point where they were better able to learn from you because they loved you, they loved the way you taught, they loved that atmosphere?
I believe so, and I think there's a broader focus. I think we learn from the people we love, the teachers we love in this case. I think we also learn, if we keep our eyes wide open, from the fools as well. From the idiots. We learn from the idiots. We model the love, hopefully. And I always attempted, as tough as I could be on my students, I always made sure, the best that I could, that they understood I was doing it for a reason, and the reason was them, not me. I wanted to have a good time doing what I was doing. And I got a Facebook post from some Stanton student last night. It was, "I just saw you in traffic."
And they recognized you?
And they recognized me. And so this was later in the night when I had seen that. And so I just said, "Well, did you wave?" And the student responded and said, "No, you were being a good driver, and you were looking at the traffic." She said, "But it was so good to see you." And then she put IRL, and I'm thinking, I don't know what that means. I'm going to go Google that.
Yeah, what does that mean?
In real life.
Oh, in real life, yes. So interesting.
I still stay in touch with so many students that I taught more than 30 years ago. I joke with them. I say, now when I said, "You're older now than I was when I taught you," which they always love to hear. And I think the point is that they're not going to stay in touch with somebody that they didn't respect, that they didn't like, that they didn't feel did something for them. I can't say if I changed their lives. I think I made an impact based on what they've told me years later. I think it's, again, because of the relationships we built. One of the things I did the first 2 years I taught 7th grade. And the first 3, when people taught 4 weeks of the school year, I'd come home from school, and after dinner that night, I would make calls to 5, 6, 7 parents, introduce myself. And it was funny because some of them would say, "Oh my gosh, what did Mark do already?"
Right.
I said, "Nothing. I just wanted to introduce
Expect
myself."
the worst.
So, in some way, when people talk about mavericks, they think about, all this bravado. That to me was being a bit of a maverick, in that the parents weren't expecting that. And early on, I was building deposits. That I'm here for you and I'm here for your kids. I'm a voice, I'm a person. Call me. And this was before, obviously, social media, so they had phone numbers for the home. And that was the cool thing. And that carried over and carried through, I believe, throughout my whole teaching career.
Do you believe that one of the most important tasks for a teacher is to help transition kids that they teach into adulthood, or show them a path into adulthood?
Yeah, well, I think it's that, and I think it even goes, again, it's a little broader. I think it's helping, I say children if we're talking, middle school and moving through, but the students, it's helping them become members of a community, in fact, various communities, that they're going to be a part of as adults, but also that they are currently a part of. I think it was also... And I believe we were fortunate with the student population we had at Stanton back in the early 1980s. They were just special students in so many great ways, and they were so inclusive. And I don't even know if I've ever used that word or that concept back then. But I remember I'd chaperone dances. And I'd go to dances on Friday nights. And I remember my wife going with me to those dances, and she would always say, "I'm just so amazed how they all like each other. They all just hung together, and they just loved each other and loved on each other." That was a community, and they were building that community. I was lucky enough to be a part of it. And then it was also, what's the community you're going to build when you leave? Communities, because there are going to be many. And then when I taught at the college level, it was the same thing. What are the communities you're working with? and I taught on an urban campus in a community college, and so many of my students had life issues that I don't know if I could have done what they have done, to get up in the morning and come to school when they had so much to contend with. And part of my job was to help them focus on themselves, even if it was just for 75 minutes in a classroom, and then how they could then broaden that reach and take care of themselves, and then how that translates to their communities. So yeah, it was to prepare them for something beyond taking a freaking test. Yeah.
You mentioned the fact that after Stanton, you went to Florida Community College at Jacksonville, which is now Florida
State College at Jacksonville.
And you taught at Urban Campus for many years.
Mm-hmm.
That difference between the two groups of students, so the one at Stanton College Prep, 9th through 12th graders, versus, let's say, more urban socioeconomic status kids. What here's an old bromide in education: all kids can learn.
Mm-hmm.
And another one, and a corollary, is all parents care about love their children and want to see them learn. Did you see that in both places? I mean, comparing one to the other, do you believe all children can learn?
Okay, and that's an interesting question, because I think it becomes, without attempting to sound like I'm parsing, but it's to me, it's the learn what. You put me into a calculus classroom, it's going to be a challenge for me to learn calculus. It really is. I might bump by, maybe. That's just not my area. Now, can they learn? Yeah. And what I found in every class I taught, and I was in the classroom for 33 years, and I'm still working with training faculty and coaching and the like. Yeah, they can learn. Okay. Now, then we start getting to the specifics, and do I belong in a calculus classroom? Okay. So we look at that. It comes down to it. I gave you something here. You have it in front of you. It's something that's actually a model that I use. I used it in my latest book, and it's just what I call the 7 R's. And these 7 R's are all part of developing, whether it's a team, whether it's a classroom. And again, you see at the top, it's relationships. It's always relationships. I think that all students can learn with the proper relationships, with the proper relevance. What does this mean to my life? And I was a stickler on that to myself in my history classes. When you leave today, you'll be able to apply this to your life, whatever we talked about. If you can't, I failed you somehow. And I meant that with them. I said, now you have skin in the game. You got to do some work here. How do we connect them with resources? How do we connect them with resources? Not just put them on a computer and say, here, go through this program. But how do we connect them with resources? Talk to them, connect to them, relate to them. How do we give them time to reflect? I mean, that was something I had to learn over my years. I bombarded my students my first probably 10 years. This one thing after another. I thought the more I taught, the better I was as a teacher. I was fortunate I had great students, and they could absorb it. But that wasn't teaching. That was talking.
So how did your teaching change over the years?
It became much more reflective. It became much more introspective on my part, and also with the students, giving them more time to step back and say, okay, let's think about what we just talked about. And it could have been just something where they wrote something for a brief period of time. They talked about it with a classmate. They talked about it in general. It led to something else, another topic, another discussion. It led to another class. For me, it was not, as I developed as a teacher, it wasn't just how much could I lecture in a given period of time. It was how many questions can we throw out there that we get some real discussion going on, the challenge. I always tell my students, we're going to talk. You're going to have opinions. I want your opinions. However, I also want your support. This was in a day when I first started teaching, before we heard of the fake news. Having said that, there were still opinions without any support. So it was always, how do you support?
Right.
And you said something that was about the parents. Do you believe all parents love their children? That again, without parsing, if we talk about parents just being a biological parent, some of those biological parents don't care. The parents I worked with, I'd have to say, by and far, without a doubt, yeah, they cared. And many of them did what they knew to do, but the system sometimes was daunting, especially if they were not maybe even high school graduates. How do they talk to college graduates? Do they feel the system understands them? And I saw that more and more when I got into the college level. And I was working with, my students were parents, okay? And so many of them were struggling because they didn't quite know what to do with their children other than what their parents did, which was in many cases just yell at them and say, study, or don't do that. They didn't have the tools. So in addition to teaching history at the college level, I found as part of my job and I gladly took on, was I needed to help those students of mine work with their students. Okay, if that makes any sense.
Sure.
And it was, and they would sometimes come to the office and talk about a challenge their children were having, and we talk about that. It wasn't part of the curriculum that I was supposed to teach, but it was part of the relationship that developed. And it goes back to the question about, are you preparing them for adulthood? You're preparing them for different communities. I've never been a parent. I was able, though, to still work with them because I've been a teacher. And this is how you can help your child. So it's kind of going in a lot of directions there.
I like you utilize the word system. And in your schematic that you handed me, you mentioned resources. Mm-hmm. I would imagine one of the things the system is supposed to provide teachers, whatever level, are resources. Resources to help teach those students that show up to your classroom every day. In today's world of public education especially, we see a dog-eat-dog struggle for limited resources, oftentimes between rural and urban, wealthy, poor, private versus public schools. And for whatever reason, I think a number of teachers become soured, cynical about the system, as you use that word, because it does not provide support, resources, meaning for them, at least not in the long term, so that they can't do their job of teaching kids. Would you say that's a safe or a fair characterization of the system that you saw or you were a part of, or can you say that the system did support you? From a very personal Steve perspective, there's a gamut there. I found early on in my career, and I would say for most of it, I was able to get resources, but I didn't ask for much. Okay, I just really didn't ask for much. Can I have a classroom? And back in the day, can I have an overhead projector with a bulb that works? You know, those were expensive. Yeah. Those are the things you could put out on the street and nobody would steal them. Right. You know, so I mean, it was pretty. There wasn't a lot that I needed in that respect. And then when it started getting really technologically developed, and I had asked for Scantron sheets, okay. As I got to the end of my K-12 years, okay, I taught in
7th through 12th grade for about 11, 12 years, and then moved into the college level. I was starting to see changes where now if you wanted to duplicate something for your students, you were limited to so many duplications in a week or in a grading period. And I started thinking, really? Come on. You know, teachers need this stuff. Okay. What used to break my heart, now I never did this, but it would break my heart, and I still see photos. It seems like the beginning of every school year. There is, I don't know, the group that's doing this, it has the right heart doing this, but it's giving supplies to teachers, and you see teachers standing like in a line for a block so that they can get supplies to bring to their classroom to teach the students that the system is giving to them. But the system won't give them the supplies that they need. And some of it, as I read about it, is pretty basic stuff. And then I hear about the teachers that, you know, put out $1,500 out of their own pocket for basic paper, pencils, crayons. And it's just like, really? That should not be. Once I got to the college level, it was a different type of resource. There would be, you know, things like, we want you to stay current in your field. We want you to go to a conference. We want you to do that. Oh, but we don't have the money to send you to those things, so it'll have to come out of your pocket. And I was fortunate. I was always able to, not always, most of the times, able to find things. But that was a case of resource. It was getting toward the end of my teaching in the classroom, even at the college level, that attempting to get a printing cartridge for my office printer, that was, well, no, we're going to start phasing that out. You'll have to do that on your own. Really? Okay. Okay. That kind of thing. So I was starting to see that creep in more and more, but I know a lot of teachers have had, I don't know how they do, especially elementary school teachers, because they're so visual, they're so tactile. There's a school, Atlantic Beach Elementary School, right around the corner from our house. I love going in there every so often to do something with the students or the teachers. And I'm always impressed. There's not an inch of the wall that's not well used. And these are the teachers that are putting in their time, their money to do that. That's just not right. That's just not right. Something has to change with that. I don't know what, but that's not right.
The at one point you mentioned, you know, more or less competition over, in this case, scarce resources or whatever. Many conservative thinkers, I'm sure you are aware, are strong believers in competition in the educational, you know, milieu. That competition between private and public, between charter schools and public schools, is good for both entities, both sides. Do you believe, two-part question, do you see and are you aware of that competition for limited resources between school choice advocates, private, parochial schools, and public schools, number one? And number two, do you believe that competition between those two groups and those two systems for limited resources is healthy, good, negative, unhealthy?
Yeah. I can't really speak to the first with much authority because I don't have the knowledge of the conversations between, you know, other than what I read and what I saw as a teacher and as a member of my teaching community. The competition, and this is just Stevie B and Stevie here, it just comes back to, for me, how does one compete if a system is rigged? How does one compete if a school in a certain part of town isn't getting the resources that are needed? And is equal funding equal? All right. So you give, and this isn't originating with me, but you give the same amount of dollars to a school that's a high-performing school socioeconomically is in a good place, and you give the same amount of dollars to that school that you give to a school that is typically struggling, and there are lots of issues within the neighborhood that have an impact on the school. And again, it comes back to a question: do the parents love their children? Well, yeah, they want their kids to do well. At the same time, some of these parents are struggling to do well. Those schools probably, it doesn't seem to be a big stretch, need a little bit more than the schools that the students are coming in at a different level, at various levels. How do you compete? To say they should and let the market, set that. I don't know. It almost seems disingenuous to say we're going to let the market decide. But the markets aren't the same. The markets aren't the same. And here I live in the beach area. It's a lot different than where I taught at the college. It's a lot different. Still got the students in the classroom that want to become part of a community, and they have dreams, and they want to get to those dreams. They're starting at such different places. So the marketplace, okay, that sounds great, okay, but I think the people making the decisions need to start talking more about what does that mean, what market. We have various marketplaces, not a marketplace. And what does each market need to help the shoppers in that market? And it might be public education. It might be a choice school. It might, I'm willing to talk about those things. But I'm just leery when people throw out the generalized, well, it's the market. We'll let the market figure this out. And we'll let parents need to have a choice. Well, that's good. But do parents understand the choice? Have parents been educated about the choice? And who's doing that educating?
America is you bring up that point, and it kind of goes to the ultimate question, I guess, about the common school movement, which then grew into the public school movement in America. Their mission always was to provide a quality education, free of charge, to every single child in America. Mm-hmm. What do you think about that concept?
Well, the concept, I think we have to go to your quality. Quality education in 1900, I would throw out, has a different definition than a quality education. And as we record this, just a few weeks away from 2018, are we preparing our students for the 20th century or the 21st century? Are we preparing them? I just did a program for some higher education faculty and administrators. And I said, okay, think back to 1997 and a student coming onto your campus. What does the student see walking into the classrooms? And you think back to that. That's at the time when if you were going to go out for a jog, you had a Walkman. You didn't have earbuds. You didn't have an iPod.
I still have my Walkman.
I bet you do. You didn't download music because in 1997, Google just got registered. We're still 6-7 years away from something called Face Mash, which became Facebook. I'm teaching in 1997 something called a telecourse. That was a weak signal for something called online education. Would we train our teachers today in 2018 coming up the same way we trained them in 1997? I think, unfortunately, in some cases we do. And the students coming in need something different. Again, what are we preparing them for? Is it adulthood? Well, yes. It's the future. I'm not a futurist, but I think we have to look and go from preparing them for that industrial job to how do you prepare for a life in which you are going to be working in serial careers. And take this, for example. You might be working in a career where you never see an office mate ever. You do it from your home computer. So you don't have that eyeball to eyeball contact. What do you do for personal resilience and growth? What happens when you don't have people to talk to? Yeah, you can type a text or an email. It's not the same. There's a neighbor of mine. She works for an insurance company, and every so often I see her walking her dogs, and she works from home. And she said it gets tiring and challenging because I don't see anybody anymore. Are we preparing our students for that possibility in the career workplace? I'm not hearing a lot of that, but are we doing that for them? So when we're preparing the students for whatever we're preparing them for, what are the signals we're looking at? What does 2028 look like? And are we going to prepare the students the same way with the same, God, we need another 40 minutes to talk about standardized testing. But are we going to do standardized tests to prepare them for 2028? I don't think so. I don't think we should.
Well, that begs this question. What is education going to look like in 2028?
Golly. And that's a phenomenal question that I wish we ended before you asked that question.
Always the slippery one. Honestly.
Yeah, you're the slippery one. It's obviously there's technology involved. Obviously, it's how do we use that technology, and it's not the newest and the slickest. It's for instance, I was recently reading some work about HR departments and what they're looking at in the future for job interviews. Job interviews, we need to change that. Rather than somebody comes in, especially in teaching, I was on so many screening committees, they come in, they answer a set series of questions. They have to do one teach, and people come in and watch them. Wouldn't it be nice, now I don't know how you work this, but it should be at least talked about, that we get Mark to come in, he wants to be a teacher with us, and we get him to come in 2 weeks, a month, whatever, and we see him on a day-to-day basis, how he handles things. I think we have to look at how we're hiring as much as what the curriculum is going to be. I think we have to pay attention to that. I think one of the things that, and it sounds like it shouldn't be futuristic, but we've lost touch with it. I used to teach, and teachers all over the country teach this, something called information literacy. How you evaluate sources, okay? How you use sources, where you find sources. All right, basic stuff. And over the last couple of years, it's pretty obvious that that's not so obvious anymore. That people aren't doing that. And I think we're going forward, we got to go backward in that very basic case of information literacy. I think also in the area of critical thinking. See, and these are the things that, I don't know, I guess you can give scenarios and test the scenarios or something, how somebody would solve something, but it's not a multiple choice answer. We need to be teaching that. Go to these 7 R's I mentioned. That, to me, is the future. What are we doing so that people can relate to one another? If we're always stuck to our digital devices, what's happening to our empathy, our capacity to empathize? Do young kids even know how to empathize? Do they know what it is? Not just the word, but the concept. that comes from relationships, but that comes from seeing somebody's eyeballs when you've insulted them and you see the impact that has. You can't see that on a screen. So how do we deal with that? I think that has to be part of it. The resources are constantly changing. So how are we constantly changing with that? I think it's disingenuous to tell teachers, well, you know, you go get the continuing education, you go buy the resources. No, these are things that the system is going to need to provide. You take a look at the reflection. We gotta teach people how to step back and just breathe, which ties into the resilience. Because we talk about resilience, and some people, that's a soft skill. Well, I think soft skills are maybe even more important than hard skills. I don't know if you're familiar with Zappos, online retailer. Got to visit them at their Vegas headquarters back in April. And they have a nap room. Now think about that. And there are schools that have nap rooms for the students. It takes a certain culture, and it's not going to happen overnight. You have to build the culture, which is part of building the hiring process. But when I asked actually the guy's name is the mayor of Zappos. That's his title, not his name, but that's his title. And I emailed him, and after I'd met him, and I said, "Tell me about the nap room. What are the metrics you have on it?" Well, see, I was talking like a 20th century person there, and he said, "We don't look at who goes into that room. We don't count the number of times somebody goes in. We don't even see who goes in." He said, "We have room for our rooms for our women who are pregnant that they can get into." He said, "We don't look at that. We provide that because we think that's being a good employer." And I'm thinking, okay, they're at a little different culture level in their institution. Zappos is also one of those places that after the training period, they bring the trainees into a room and say, "Okay, you know our culture. You've been here I don't know if it's 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks. If you aren't totally committed, we will give you," and it's $2,000, $3,000, $4,000. I don't remember the exact amount, but we'll give you a check right now to walk away. And the people stay. That's building a culture. And wouldn't it be nice if we can do that with our students? I think going back to the Stanton thing that we started with, Mark, those students that I taught, yeah, there are exceptions here or there, you couldn't have paid them to leave that school. They loved what we built there. But you see, we built it. And a lot of that, the discussion has to happen. But there has to be a tearing down in some way of what we're doing in a rebuilding. I don't know, somebody has to lead the conversation. Mm-hmm. And we have to start doing that, because to continue what we're doing, you're not going to get students or the teachers to their rainbows, to their goals, to their dreams. You got them being mechanized people. And cynically, maybe there are some people that want that. You keep certain people in certain roles, and then everything is always taken care of. I don't buy that.
That leads me to two final short questions, Steve. Number one is, why aren't you in teaching anymore?
All right. One was, and we talked about this off mic, when I left the Stanton, when I left what's called the public school system, some of that mirrors why I finally left the college system, and is that for me it was time to move on. There's a strategy I developed over the years, and I've just recently given it a name, and I call it the second read, READ being an acronym. And over the years, I started looking at, when I'm doing something, whatever the goal is, whatever the end result is that I'm looking for, do I like the people I'm working with? Those are the relationships again. Do I trust them? Can I learn from them? Can I grow with them? Do they accept me and I accept them? Do I have the enthusiasm? And boy, to be a teacher, you've done it, and I know you had a long commute on top of the teaching. Boy, you got to have energy. And at some point, sometimes I think it's really a young person's job, but I think it's young person mind as well as body. got to have that energy every day to do it. Can you be authentic? That's the maverick, I think. Or do you have to be somebody else? And can you make a difference? I believe that the entire time I was in the system, I always stayed authentic. What you saw was what you got. I mean, this was it. I always believed I could make a difference. Some days it felt harder than others. As I was going longer into the system, the energy was starting to wane. I never lost it, but I realized I did not want to become one of those teachers that this showed up because, you know what, I can get a few more years into the retirement system, and that never wanted to do that. So I think I left when I still had a lot in the tank, but I knew the tank was starting to get empty. But it had a ways to go. It was draining. And I was starting to question whether some of the people who were leading knew what in the world they were doing. In fact, I was convinced that at the college level, I was seeing fewer leaders and more managers, and many of them were mismanaging. And that was, I just, did what I could, and then I thought, well, maybe I can do something from the outside in. I've done it for 33 years, the inside, now the outside. And so, and no regrets, absolutely none about my teaching career. Loved it. And no regrets about leaving when I did. For me, it was the right time. And I think if it was the right time for me, then it was the right time for my students.
So the last question or comment I have, Steve, is this. It strikes me how often you come back to relationships. And it seems like, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, the Growth and Resilience Network really is about, at the heart or at the core, the relationship between mentor and mentee, teacher and student, trainer and trainee, consultant and the person being, educated. Does that, if that's true, if I've characterized it correctly, that it's about relationships, that would seem to have some optimistic element to it in terms of the future, because if we train and hire and educate talented people who can develop these relationships with a new age of students, seems to me like education, like any other institution, can move forward.
Oh, I definitely think so. I have people sometimes say, "Well, how can you be so hopeful?" Well, hope is really it's a combination of expectation and desire, and we might at times not expect the best. The desire part, though, is I don't want to ever give up on the desire that, it can be better. Yeah, it definitely can be better. And it's a voice that people, a lot of teachers, I think, as a group, I understand it when I would work with single moms. They were teachers, I'm talking. They were struggling themselves, just like many of my students. They just had a lot on their plates to deal with. And sometimes they would get a little cowed by an overbearing manager that didn't want to hear them even thinking about being a maverick. And so they wouldn't speak up. And I think that's what our faculty, and faculty do this around the nation, around the world, but to speak up. Doesn't have to be ugly. It's just letting people know that are leading that this isn't working. This is not working for the kids. It's not working for the teachers. It's not working for the community. If your schools aren't working, what are you doing for the future of your community? So I have hope. I do have hope that can change. And there are pockets. There are pockets. Unfortunately, I still hear the teachers that say, I only got 5 years left to retirement. And that is deadly. That's absolutely deadly. And on the other end, at the college level especially, I've seen young, newly minted PhDs come in and say, I'm only going to be at this school for a couple of years, 3 years, 4 years, because I'm going to get to a big R1 institution where I belong. 10 years later, they're at the same school, and they have created an environment because of their complacency. That doesn't help anybody, and now they're stuck. Why? In part because of what they did not do. So I'm hopeful that they do, that they come together with the relationships, and that people would start listening more rather than screaming at one another.
Well, Steve, I want to thank you for being in the hot seat for this GRN podcast. On behalf of the students you've taught, and more than the students who loved you and adored you, the colleagues you worked with, you were the finest classroom teacher I've ever seen in my life. You remain that today. Your optimism, your energy is undeniable, unbelievable, overwhelming. It almost makes me want to be positive. But not quite.
Not quite. Yeah.
But I do want to thank you, Steve, for your honest answers and your intelligent commentary. It's been wonderful. I enjoyed it.
I appreciate it. And you know my respect for you, Mark, over the years. In fact, Mark and I, listeners, I always said to him, back 30 years ago, I said, we needed to have a radio show. Just call it Teacher Please. Teacher, please answer this for me. And have a dialogue. So who knows? Maybe there will be such a viral reaction to this. In a good way, viral. We'll have to
Not the kind when you need penicillin.
We'll have to create a show. Yes, Teacher Please. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve.
And bye-bye.